This is The Persuasion Game, the Forges podcast all about the art of persuasion. Each episode, we connect with marketers, business leaders and beyond to learn how they use persuasion to influence their customers, convince their stakeholders and drive their businesses forward. Hello, Laura.
Hello, how are you?
Very good, thank you. Great to have you back.
Yes, I was listening with envy on the last one.
Yeah, well, we got Julian back today, so that's exciting. You get to talk to him today.
Excellent.
And today we're talking all about, now don't turn off if you're listening to this.
This is going to be really good.
Yeah, we are talking about portfolio strategy. And as much as it sounds like it might, be in a marketing textbook, we're going to be talking about it today with someone that's passionate about it and has been managing one of the biggest beauty portfolios, and that is Unilever's.
Yeah, exactly. I think the fact that it's beauty, the fact that it's so dynamic, and the fact that Julian is as creative a thinker and creative a strategist as he is will mean it's a really illuminating discussion.
Let's get into it. During Julian's 26 years at Unilever, he led global and regional strategy, M&A and global brand expansion for Unilever's beauty brands, before acting as EMEA and ANZ CMO for its €1 billion beauty portfolio. Having looked at this ever-dynamic and expanding category from multiple different angles, he's the perfect person to talk to us about creating and growing a winning portfolio. Welcome, Julian.
Hello.
So great to have you here.
I'm happy to be here. So thanks for having me again.
Yay.
Well, welcome back. Yeah. You're the first podcast returning guest. So
Cool.
Yeah.
So Julian, today we're talking all about portfolio. And obviously you spent a long time at Unilever looking after the beauty portfolio. In your view, how high up a CMO's agenda should setting the portfolio strategy be?
I think portfolio management should be a top priority for any CMO. At the end, it's about defining the way you are going to play with your different brands, your ammunition, in order to deliver the ambition that you have set up portfolio for your company, for your business, right? So I think that it is important, right, that you are clear on what is the specific role that each of your brands is going to play in your strategy. And you need to be able to communicate that as well. So the sharper the strategy, the simple will be to communicate this with everyone, internally and externally, with your team, with your partners, with your investors. So portfolio management or strategy, I think it's critical.
Yeah, and there's a sort of perception, isn't there, that it's actually one of the hardest things that you can do. I mean, would you say that's true? Or if not, why does that myth prevail?
Well, I'm not sure if it's a myth, because in fact, it can be hard. Because at the end, some people might have it super clear. This is what we need to do. I have all the information. And even if I don't have the information, I'm making the bet because I have the authority to do it, right? But normally speaking, sometimes you don't have enough data. You need to play a bit with your gut feeling. You need to consider not just what is right for you at that moment in time, but what is right for the future. Some portfolio decisions are not only impacting your current or next fiscal year, they can impact the value of your business. If you think that maybe a brand is not playing any role anymore in your portfolio, and you might need to dispose that brand, or you might need to just discontinue the brand, well, it's not an easy decision. Also, emotions, I think, are very important. Not just your own emotions, how confident you feel yourself to make a decision, but also others' emotions and points of view. Political games. Right? At the end, we know that every single company, doesn't matter the size of the company or the complexity, there is a political discussion. Not everyone will have the same point of view. But something I really like to help everyone to understand is that strategy is not a democracy, right? Someone should make a call. The rest, they just need to align as much as possible and execute it. So going back to your question, no, it's not always easy or straightforward because there's a lot of different elements from a rationality perspective and emotions perspective that you need to consider.
I love that strategy is not a democracy. I think that's a really interesting way to cut through that challenge, and probably especially prevalent at Unilever, where not only did you have a sort of huge multiplicity of brands, but also really different strengths in different markets. So I can imagine, brands sitting in a lot of different positions and people feeling very differently about which should be the hero and which should be the ones that, sort of fall by the wayside. How do you manage that kind of internal politics, the challenge of that?
Well, you nail it. So this is one of the day-to-day challenging conversations that any global company is having. Local voice versus the global voice versus the regional voice. So how to play that. And I think that you always need to think about what's best for your company and for your brands and for your investors, right? You need to get to some commitments. Ideally, where possible, it is amazing to have global brands with global mixes, but that's not always easy. There are some industries where it's probably a bit easier. Beauty is probably one of them. But then you have foods, which is totally different. You might have a global brand, but the local flavor, the local preferences, well, this is something that you need to consider. So it's always about finding the right balance in terms of what's best.
Yeah, that's interesting, that kind of cultural more of how much does that actually impact what you put into the market versus beauty, which you could argue is very personal, but actually probably some more universal needs. Just thinking about beauty specifically, because that's obviously your world of expertise. It's a really challenging category, isn't it? Because it's enormously competitive. And also there's probably a perception that more is more. There's so many different brands that could play different roles. Can you tell us a little bit about your beauty category experience?
Beauty is a very complex category, right? But it's also a growing category. It's true that it's suffering a bit, but there are always pockets of growth. And the point is that it's a category, it's expandable, right? Because you will always have new consumers that you need to persuade. You will always have new needs, new formats, new benefits. So it's always expanding. I think the challenge from a portfolio perspective is that, especially if you're a big corporation, you might have more than one or two brands. So you need to be very choiceful on what you are going to do because, surprise, you cannot do everything, right? You cannot support properly every single brand in your portfolio. From an innovation perspective, from a brand building perspective, you need to have some prioritization. So I think that going back to the initial conversation on strategy, you need to have clarity on what is the expected future for your business, where you think you can capitalize that growth that we were referring to in beauty specifically, but that's something transferable to any category, right? Mm-hmm. Then you need to check what's the ability of each of the brands in your portfolio to capitalize that future growth. Some brands are perfect and ready to win. So these are the brands where you probably need to focus. And some of them might be even global brands. But you might have some brands that, well, they are all dated. The proposition might still be relevant, but there is a job to do on the way you tell your storytelling.
Yes.
So this is something that you need to consider. And some brands, they might not be relevant anymore, right? Because they are designed to cover a need, functional or emotional, that it's not a need of the future anymore. If you think about Stock Cubes or Bovril, for instance, these are brands from the past. So you need to make sure that you evolve as your consumers are evolving, but the moment you see a significant gap from a proposition perspective is where you are in trouble.
This is an interesting discussion about being prepared to let brands that were no longer relevant go. But that obviously creates a gap, and there's different ways to fill that gap in a portfolio, aren't there? Can you tell us a little bit about your experience of that?
Once you identify your opportunities to grow and the spaces where you want to grow, because the future is going in that direction, you need to understand if your current portfolio is fit to win or not. Or if you need to acquire a brand, for instance, or even to create a new brand. There's not many corporations building new brands these days because it's quite resources consuming and time consuming.
Risky.
And risky as well. And you don't always have the right capabilities. That's why a lot of corporations, they decide to acquire brands. In fact, in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a lot of different movements in the market, a lot of different brands in different industries being acquired, because this is a perfect solution, right? Once you identify this gap and you identify a potential brand that is doing the job and can do the job in the future as well, why not to acquire it, right?
Perfect. Great. Obviously, Unilever had a lot of brands with a lot of history. How did you balance that kind of need for old and new in your portfolio?
My personal view is that your brand heritage is your brand heritage, right? So you just cannot delete it.
You can't scrub it out.
Yeah, it's there. You just need to not reinvent the story, but you need to find a new way to tell the story, to make the story relevant for your new consumers, and to speak as much as possible their language, and even tell the story where it matters for them, to make it visual. The story of a brand that was a successful brand in the 80s, but it's not connecting with Gen Z. You cannot do the job from TV, telling the same story with the same tone of voice you were telling the story 40 years ago. So you need to find a way.
Sorry, that was just a terrifying moment for us.
I know. I was shocking myself as well. Right?
No, you are correct. Good Lord.
But is that brand relevant anymore? Yeah, maybe it can be, but you need to translate your story to the language of the Gen Z.
Yes.
Right? And in the media of the Gen Z, might not be TV, might be social. And probably it's not even yourself telling your story, might be a content creator. So I think that you need to be able to understand where your brand is, but also to be conscious on what's the effort to migrate your brand, but not from a proposition perspective, but from a storytelling perspective on the how, where, and to whom you tell the story.
Yeah, that's it. So we could have a Maxwell House, playing out on TikTok with like two creators. Are they going to get together over a cup of coffee years and years later? But just going back to beauty, we do know that people have really specific needs in beauty, and you can go down an absolute wormhole of layers upon layers of very specific needs. And that can be seen as having a good thing. So people look for very specific variants, very specific product offerings. But how do you balance that with the understandable drive, especially from retailers and shareholders, to have sort of fewer, bigger, better brands?
So yeah, you are right. Normally speaking, all customers, they are looking for ways on simplifying and make the portfolio they have in their stores a bit more efficient. But somehow I think that specifically in beauty, they are aware that they need a broader portfolio, because I think it's a more complex category, right? If you want to persuade the different shoppers, you need to offer them everything they might need. But it's true that you really need to understand what the shopper is looking for in your store. What's the shopper mission, right? If they are there to discover, if they are there just to buy, quick and fast. In fact, this is probably content for another full episode, shopper missions and how to connect strategies and portfolios in store. But still, the challenge for all the brands is on making efficient whatever you have. And for big corporations, that's, again, about the choices in portfolio. You might be lucky and you might have a brand that's having the power and the ability to connect with different target audiences, and they can offer all the solutions for all the needs. You might think, let's put an example, in face care, L'Oreal or Nivea. So these are very generic brands. They are touching, they are engaging with different target audiences from an age perspective, also from a face, skin care needs perspective, but it's not the case of all the brands. Mm-hmm. So then if you are the owner of different brands, you need to understand if they are generic or very niche or very specific, and you need to play with that in order to make sure you have the best portfolio to compete in the today and in the future.
Can I ask you a question about customers and retailers? Because it's a question I've wondered for a while. Is it a benefit to have, in the case of Unilever, say in Deos, 3 big brands, Axe, Rexona and Dove, taking up more shelf space and therefore getting more eyeballs on Unilever products? Or is it better being a Nivea with one product on the shelf at that time? Like what's the sort of balance there? Like the fewer, bigger, better, or the more opportunities to kind of be bought in that moment?
I would say it depends on what your ambition is, right? And what your strategy is, right? Also, we tend to think that in the case of Beiersdorf, they only have Nivea, but no, they have Nivea, they have La Prairie, they have Eucerin. So they have a portfolio of brands, but it's true that a bit more focused on one specific category, paying at different price points, targeting different consumers. In the case of Dios, Unilever, that's pretty similar as well. You are having a different brand targeting one specific audience, also at different price points, because you have Dove that's a bit more premium than Sure or Rexona. And then you have Axe that's a bit more male-oriented. So I guess that it depends on your ambition. It depends on your portfolio choices. Sometimes you might think that with just one brand, you are able to capitalize all the potential growth. Sometimes you might need 2 or 3, right? Okay. If you're lucky and you have 4 and 5 and you can support them, perfect. But portfolio choices, sometimes you might think that with just one brand, you are able to capitalize all the potential growth. Sometimes you might need 2 or 3, right? Okay. If you're lucky and you have 4 and 5 and you can support them, perfect. But that's quite difficult.
One thing you were saying, talking about categories, is I started thinking the thing that's interesting is as you look at like health and well-being kind of conflating, categories like deos start to get very close to skincare. And in fact, you kind of enter a bit of an interesting mix where you're not even saying, oh, well, this is my beauty category and this is my deos category, but this kind of hybrid world where ideally your brand is present everywhere, but also it can create a bit of competition even between categories, I would guess.
Yes, right. So that's one of the challenges, right, for the marketeers responsible for all these different categories, that they can easily overlap each other because the boundaries are blurring. The benefits of a shower gel under, let's say, a brand like Dove are quite high, right?
So people might choose either
is
or.
very high, right?
Yeah.
So people might choose A or B. Of course, the challenge and the creativity of the marketeers is to make sure that you convince them that no, in reality, they need A plus B plus C.
Welcome to capitalism.
Welcome to capitalism. Welcome to marketing, right?
Yeah.
At the end, it's about making sure the customers or consumers, they are aware about their needs and you offer them your best solution, right? So you can solve the pain they have.
But that's a really interesting challenge, isn't it? Where you think, not only am I having to think about multiple potential different brands, but I'm also having to think about how to be additive across categories. So, yes, the shower gel works, but then the skincare, afterwards works in complement to what I've just offered you.
But yeah, it's a bit of a challenge, but also it's a positive challenge sometimes, right? Because that sparks your creativity. I would not call it internal competition, but sometimes you kind of need to think, okay, if my colleagues in that specific category, they are offering the same benefit I'm offering in my category, where I'm going next? What is the new rationale, the new reason why I'm going to give the consumers to make sure that they will use a shower gel, but also they will use a body lotion?
What I love about what you're saying there is I remember when I was a very junior brand manager, your KPIs are based on the success of your brand. And it can be tempting to look at another brand in the same category, Surf, and be like, why have they got this benefit? We should have it, and almost feel like you're sort of at war with each other. But I think what you're saying is everyone has a job to kind of helicopter up a little bit and look at how you can be additive across a portfolio rather than just how can I win as my brand?
Yeah, and let's not forget about something which is critical. You need to have the internal discussions on what's the right strategy for that brand, what are the spaces that we want to occupy, because you need to join forces. But it's true that in some companies, in some specific moments in time, they might probably not have the conversations they need. And that's why sometimes you see master brands that are struggling a bit or launching different messages depending on the category where they are communicating. So, yeah.
And then the other layer that's so interesting about beauty is that people's needs change over time. So, it could be that you grow up for a long time. What you like in a food category is obviously, as you say, informed by culture, but you're not suddenly going to change your palate when you hit your 40s. Whereas, surprise, surprise, your skincare regime is probably going to change quite a lot. How do you play a portfolio well to kind of address the fact that you might potentially lose the consumers purely because of the life stage that they've got into?
So yeah, indeed, Lola. The beauty category is very dynamic and the consumer needs are evolving as the consumer is evolving, right? You don't have the same need, if you think about your face skincare needs, when you are a teenager than when you are senior. When you are a teenager, you might be obsessed by acne, right? Or your oily skin. When you're senior, well, your main obsession is with the wrinkles.
I mean,
right?
how long is the list? But yeah.
Yeah, well, the list is much longer, right? But yeah, consumer needs are different. Not all the brands, they are having the power to be able to be a companion of a consumer since the 15th anniversary of the consumer when they are teenagers to the 50s. Few brands, they might be able to, right? L'Oreal, they can do it, right? But they are the number one beauty brand. Beyond that, other brands, they need to do the exercise of making choices. What are the specific consumer needs I want to address? What are the different audiences I want to address? What are the right moments for me to engage with them? And you need to recognize that, yeah, you might lose some customers, some consumers. But that's why you need to be focused on Biden Sharp. That's why you need to go back to the basics and think about what Biden Sharp is always reminding us. So you need to continuously build penetration, right?
But what about brands like Drunk Elephant, where there's been like a very overt attempt? You could say they've done the Byron Shop playbook, right? They've gone like, well, we know who's growing, tweens.
Yeah.
Let's go after tweens. But it sort of feels like perhaps it hasn't quite landed in the way that they imagined. I don't know. Maybe they're very happy with it.
Yeah. I mean, maybe they're already happy. So that from the outside, right, what you can guess based on the conversations, right, that we've been seeing in social, etc., is that maybe they were running too fast, right? I mean, let's not forget, Drunk Elephant has been there for what, 10, 15
not long.
years, not that long. So I think that they try to build penetration with the new generations, Gen Z, because they are quite engaged with the category, with beauty and skincare specifically and face care. But maybe the way they were changing their, not storytelling, but the tone of voice, or maybe they missed to really understand well their core consumer, their core audience. So I think that here there was a bit of a gap in understanding their consumer willingness for going too fast and maybe not being clear with what was their tone of voice.
I think it's such an interesting example because I read a meme the other day which said, why are the people that want to go to bed putting the people that don't want to go to bed, talking about people with young children? And it feels a bit like that with Drunk Elephant, where it's like, why are the people that have a lot of skin needs spending money on the people that don't have any skin needs? You know, it's like, it's the double resentment of the parent having to buy something for the kids when they just don't need it, right?
Yep. I mean, the point is that sometimes as a brand, or as a marketeer, you feel yourself in the obligation of jumping.
You see an
to
opportunity.
address the opportunity, right? And that's why I'm always going back to the strategy. Was their strategy transferring from a more senior consumer to a teenager consumer? Because let's not forget Gen Z, and especially the target audience that Drunk Elephant was talking to were teenagers. Are you sure this is your most strategic move? Of course, you want to keep recruiting the young generations, but maybe without sacrificing your storytelling and your tone of voice.
I think it goes back to your point about channels as well, in that maybe there was a lot of excitement about channels like TikTok as a new way of telling stories, but there wasn't necessarily a thought about how strategically does that ladder up to the way we position ourselves.
Yeah. And at the end, you need to make sure that everything you do as a brand, it's kind of coherent and consistent, coherent across the different touch points with the consumer or shopper, but also consistent, right? Over time.
Yes, I suppose the interesting thing as well is I think in beauty, people feel very emotively attached to brands that they feel work. So there's almost a sense of repulsion's too strong a word, but certainly like rejection or frustration. That
Why have you abandoned me at my
exactly. I needed you.
Yeah.
You know, the sort of perhaps is why this conversation has played out as much as it has in this category.
Yeah, probably. And again, in the case of Drunk Elephant, some consumers were putting their faith and their hope in that specific brand because they thought this is going to work for me. The moment they are addressing teenagers, well, I mean, they don't have the same skin,
No,
right?
just a ball of collagen.
They have a different need. So then, well, I can understand that some consumers started to think, well, if they are the best brand to address the teenager skincare needs, they might not be the best brand for me because they have a very different skin, right?
Quite right.
So just zooming back out to the wider world of FMCG, So we hear a lot about the kind of squeezed middle. So there's lots of brands in the kind of middle of portfolios that are getting, losing market share or losing, their customers. But the premium brands and some of the value brands or own label brands are potentially doing quite well. So what's your perspective on that? And like, is there a kind of shift in how, you would want to set up your portfolio for growth?
I think that, again, this goes back to the point of what's going to succeed in the future. Somehow you need to do your best in understanding where your consumers are going to, what are the needs that they might have in the future, and make sure that you can play that game, that you are going to be able to connect with that future consumer, address the need that they might have. If you miss that understanding, you might be a bit lost, right? And then it's when you start to be squeezed in the middle. Also because, in fact, as you said, there's a lot of private labels, value brands that they are doing quite well. Main driver, potentially the distribution they have and the price. But if you want to win in terms of value and in terms of volume, you need to do something a bit more creative. It's true that the premium brands are growing, but also there's a lot of niche brands that are growing. And why is that? I think it's because, well, they are in their sweet spot. They've been able to understand where the consumer is going, and they are focusing their efforts there, creativity, resources, and they are also very passionate about what they are doing. Something that in the brands in the middle, and in some cases the brands at the top, because let's be honest, the market is not growing. And this is because the brands at the top, they are not doing the right job in stimulating the demand. So if you want to stimulate the demand, you need to be a bit more creative and you need to be passionate about what you are doing. So I think that probably a bit of an elaborated answer to your question, but if I need to summarize it, I would say I'm sure that every single brand that is as creative as they can and as passionate as they can is winning.
Yeah. You've raised such a good point there because it's a bit like luxury fashion, isn't it? Where in beauty, you can have a hero product that is absolutely sort of front and center of the whole brand proposition. I mean, I know every single brand talks about their hero product, but really, people will care passionately. Let's say Arborian, when they talk about like their CC cream, they then use that to kind of ladder to all sorts of associations that can then extend into skincare and, cleansing, moisturizing, but it's often rooted in like this deep credibility of one product. And that's a lot harder to do, isn't it, when you're kind of a well-established brand with mass distribution and potentially a lot of different SKUs?
Yes, I think it's challenging, but I guess it's doable, right? I think that it depends on how much time you have to be creative. I mean, the other day, we're having a really good conversation over lunch on what is the available time that marketeers are having these days to be creative, to think, right? Because you have a lot of internal processes, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of conversations, but you don't have time to think. And marketing is about creativity. And not only the creativity that you are empowering others to do on your behalf. It's also about the creativity that you need to bring to life and not just thinking about, okay, what's the next campaign idea, but what's the right strategy?
Yes.
Defining strategy is about creativity as well, because you need to think, right? And you need to think, you need to be visionary, because no one is going to tell you that you can check with Nostradamus, right? But no one will tell you that's how the future will look like. Okay, easy. Let me decide what to do. No, you need to guess what the future will look like. You need to understand where your consumers and customers are going.
What sources would you tell people to look for in terms of that inspiration about where things are evolving to? Because it is so hard to get that external perspective. But as you say, it's so critical to shaping your thinking about where the category might be. What tips would you give to people listening?
They can connect with the Forge.
Yes.
Nah, just joking.
End of podcast.
No, I mean, I've been always obsessed with being external oriented, which is something that everyone's been told and everyone keeps telling everyone, but we don't allow ourselves the time to do it. But stay aware about what's happening around you. Find your sources. Depending on the industry where you are, the sources might be different, right? But try to understand the macro politics right? What's happening in the world, and then the micro. What will even think about not only what's happening now, but what will happen in the future. I mean, you think about the evolution of the age pyramid. Clearly, in the future, we will be a much senior population. Despite Gen Z is here and it's quite strong and quite vocal, etc. And there might be a minority in the future, right? So you need to understand, should I find a way to engage with the seniors? Or should I find a way to engage with the juniors? Talk with people. Even if you don't have time to talk with people, just follow them, right? On socials. Socials is an amazing window to understand what's happening in the world, in your industry, for your consumer. So yeah, try to even follow people that probably yourself will not follow because you don't sympathize with them, or they don't have anything relevant for you, but they might have it for your consumer.
And finally, Julian, you've talked previously about the importance of both logic and magic when setting strategy. Can you just share a little bit more about that today?
Yeah, sure. I think that from my perspective, not just when defining your portfolio strategy, but for nearly everything, you always need to balance the logic and the magic. The logic is everything that it's fact-based, right? That it's process-oriented, that it's kind of a bit more rational. Magic is about the emotions. It's also about the creativity. It's also about the human connection. So I think that in terms of portfolio, well, logic is about having the data that will give you the sufficient insights to make a decision. Also is the possibility to even estimate what's the impact from a financial perspective or on some of the decisions. Magic is more about how you deal with the emotions of the people involved in decision making or in the execution of the decisions. So this is always for me the balance between these two elements, right? At the end, it's always linked back to the brain and the system 1 and the system 2. So I think for every single decision, you always need to consider both.
Fantastic. We've really enjoyed this. I didn't know portfolio could be so creative. So thank you so much for inspiring us.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. Thanks for both episodes.
Thank you both.
So, Adam, even more pearls of wisdom from Julian there. What was your takeout?
Well, first of all, we're so lucky to have him on this podcast. Yeah. I mean, his experience is really kind of shining through, isn't it, in what he's done in building
the most thoughtful guest. Yeah.
Yes, and well prepared, we must say as well. Look, I really loved that. I loved how many times he talked about creativity and about that kind of very human skill of being able to take the time to think through a problem, come up with a solution, and kind of work out what it is you're going to be doing and how you do it. And then there's no real substitute for that. You know, in this kind of time-pressured world that we live in, you know, you can't shortcut that. You can't find a way around that particular bit of it. So that, I think, is really important. That's a really key learning, I think, for me. I love strategy is not a democracy. I mean, that is...
I love anything not being a democracy, apart from politics, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's so true, right? You can't crowdsource a strategy. So yeah,
it's that kind of accountability, but also like, this is how we're going to get consensus. This is the big bets.
Yeah.
And on that note, I thought what was really inspiring about hearing this from him was, as you say, creativity and also the sort of future facingness of it. Yeah. That you know, this is really about imagining future scenarios that people are going to be playing with, and then placing your bets accordingly. And I think the other thing that was really interesting was, I guess I'd always seen it as sort of brand versus brand, and what you have to educate yourself on is, no, it's about, you know, growing a category. But actually Julian took it a step further and said, well, look, the way things are evolving, it's, you know, category, you need a category additive strategy. You know, you could have your skincare sitting alongside your skin cleansing, and that is not, you know, a distinction a consumer is making. They're actually seeing all of these needs as kind of interrelated. So you really need to think holistically about how all of your brands in all of your categories are playing an additive story where they want to keep buying you. And that's, I mean, it's a big challenge, but it's a fascinating one, and it's a very motivating one for marketers, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's really motivating. Well, that point he made about, you know, any brand at any point in the price tiering can do it if they're close enough to the consumer, passionate enough about the needs, understand enough about the journey the consumer is on and what they're trying to solve,
Yeah.
any brand within that portfolio can grow. So I think it's really exciting and quite inspiring to listen to him talk.
Great stuff. See you soon.
See you soon. Thanks for listening. If you'd love to hear more from marketers, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about how to use the art of persuasion to drive your business forward, then make sure you're following the podcast in your favourite podcast app. And just a last ask from us. This is a new podcast, and we'd love it if you could be persuaded to help us spread the word by telling somebody else about it, leaving us a review, or even better, sharing an episode on social media. Search The Forge on LinkedIn.